Hello and welcome to the Storeroom of Scripture. I'm Jeff Johnson. Today we will look at the beginning of Daniel chapter 11, verses 1 through 20. This chapter is a detailed but cryptic history stretching from the time of Cyrus, king of Persia, to the time of Antiochus IV, the king of Seleucid Syria. As I walk us through the history of Daniel chapter 11, I'm going to replace the cryptic references with proper names, the people and places mentioned in this chapter. Towards the end of the lesson, I'll take a step back and consider what this means. What is the writer trying to teach us about history with this cryptic history lesson? I suggest that we are meant to understand that God is the Lord of history. History unfolds according to His purpose and His plan, even when the circumstances are bad for those that are faithful to Him. His plan and His people will eventually prevail.
This week we are in Daniel chapter 11. You know, I tend to be academic sometimes in my approach to scriptures. I always want to read about what the words mean, and I'm trying to find the connections between things in the scripture. Sometimes it can be a little dry and academic. Well, I'll tell you what, this chapter is about as academic as it's going to get, because Daniel chapter 11 is, at least until towards the end, when there are some discussions about what it means, but for the lion's share of this chapter is just a history lesson told ambiguously with no particular names or dates, just ambiguous references to this king of the north or king of the south or other people. So we're going to disambiguate Daniel 11, the first several verses in this chapter. Now, I can do so with confidence this week because scholars of all stripes are in pretty universal agreement as to what these historical references are until verse 35. The dispensational, premillennial dispensationalists have a clear demarcation in Daniel 11 at verse 35. So up until verse 35 is one thing, verse 36 and following is something entirely different. And so they have a clear demarcation there. And we are not going to get to verse 35 or 36 this week. From verse 35 up to the beginning of the chapter, everybody agrees on everything as far as what it means. It's pretty actually astounding that they do, but they do. Remember, chapter 11 is a continuation of chapter 10. In chapter 10, just to summarize, Daniel is praying. He has a vision beside the river Tigris of a heavenly man. And some think that this heavenly figure that's apparently, as we learn later, is above the Tigris River, is the one talking with Daniel in chapter 10. I tend to think it's not that figure personally, but rather Gabriel in his normal guise come to talk to Daniel and explain what's going on. But at the end of chapter 10, he says, we're going to get into that explanation, and then chapter 11 is where we pick up from there. The beginning of chapter 11 is the beginning of the explanation of Gabriel / the heavenly figure. In verse 1 we read, "And I, in the first year of Darius the Mede, I stood as a support and as a protection for him." Now this is using language that was used in the previous chapter for when, and I'm just going to say Gabriel because I'm convinced that's who it was, when Gabriel says he was coming to Daniel and he was opposed by the prince of Persia and could not come until Michael assisted him and stood up for him. And so then that freed Gabriel up to continue to come to Daniel and give this explanation. Well, standing is this common phrase. In fact, in Hebrew, the word stood or stand is a repeated key word throughout this whole passage. It does not come across in English as well, because the word for stand is translated as exalted or stood or remained, or there's lots of little variants on how this word is translated, and so it comes across muddled in the translation into English. But in Hebrew, there's this idea of standing. Who is standing? And who's standing with? What are we standing against? That's kind of a theme throughout chapter 11. A continuation from the end of chapter 10. And here he says, I was standing as a support for Darius the Mede. I think this is meant for us to understand that the defeat of the Babylonian Empire by either the Median Empire or by Persia, however you want to cast that, but the defeat of Babylon was a divinely orchestrated event. And Gabriel was part of it. He stood with Darius, opposed to Belshazzar / Nabonidus of the Babylonian Empire. And so this was a part of it. All of these events, these visions of Daniel, are a message that history follows God's design. And the fall of Babylon was God's design, and Gabriel was instrumental in making sure that happened. And so Gabriel stood with Darius and supported him against the Babylonians. And after that little moment, then he says in the first sentence of verse 2, Daniel 11, verse 2a, and now I will reveal the truth to you. I think this use of the word truth is hearkening back to the end of chapter 10, where he said that there was a book of truth that God had, and that book of truth was the future history, was what God had dictated would happen. And so now Gabriel says, I'm going to reveal that truth to you. Then after that, he gets into the sort of ambiguous language. I am going to present all of the rest of the verses that we're going to talk about this morning on two separate slides. The first slide is going to simply be the text of the Lexham English Bible translation of the scripture. On the second slide, I am going to replace all of the ambiguous references to people by ambiguous imagery with proper names. The proper names of the people that scholars agree these refer to. So the second part of this second verse in Daniel 11 says, look, still 3 kings will arise in Persia, and the 4th will get abundance and great wealth, even more than all of them. And when he becomes strong through his wealth, then he will stir up everyone against the kingdom of Javan. Well, let's disambiguate that. What are these 3 kings? Who are we talking about? I'll read it again with the names in place. Look, still, Cambyses II, Darius the Great, and Xerxes I will arise in Persia. And Xerxes I will get abundance and great wealth, even more than all of them. And when he becomes strong through his wealth, then he will stir up everyone against Greece. Those are the kings that are assumed to be the 3 additional kings. So Cyrus is the first, and then there are 3 more. So that's a total of 4. That's why Xerxes is the 4th, because Cyrus is the first. Cyrus, Cambyses II, Darius the Great, and Xerxes the First. There's actually technically another between Cyrus and Cambyses II, an older son, but he reigned for like days, and didn't do anything notable in that time. So most people, let's just kind of write him off. Cambyses II is really the one considered to be the successor to Cyrus. So then Darius the Great and Xerxes the First. Now, this would give the impression that those were the only 4 kings after Cyrus, only 3 kings after Cyrus, and then Persia is attacked by Greece. But that's just not true. The vision of Daniel omits almost 150 years of Persian history that do not bear on this. The thing that has bearing is that Xerxes got the Grecians riled up way back. And for 150 years, the tensions between Greece and Persia never settled down. But they sort of started with Xerxes. And then they bubbled up periodically over time until finally, Alexander the Great shows up. But here's a complete list of all the dominant kings. There are a few in between some of these who, again, reigned for a month or something small. But these are the ones that are considered the kings of Persia in this second major Persian Empire. Cyrus the Great, Cambyses II, Darius the Great, Xerxes I, Artaxerxes I, Xerxes II, Darius II, Artaxerxes II, Artaxerxes III, and Darius III. Those are all of them. The ones that we know a little bit about, if you're a biblical student, would be Xerxes, because he's not only mentioned here indirectly, but he is the Ahasuerus of Esther. So that Xerxes is that one. And then Artaxerxes the first would be the Artaxerxes who gave decrees to Ezra and Nehemiah, allowing them to go back. Ezra taking a contingent of Levites with him to reestablish Torah, and Nehemiah, of course, to rebuild the wall. So those three really kind of have a lot of notoriety in Scripture. Cyrus, for letting the Jews return, Xerxes the first for Esther, and Artaxerxes the first for Ezra and Nehemiah. So those get some notable ink time. But Xerxes the first is notable here because of the antagonism that he raised against the Greeks. And then verses 3 and 4. And the mighty king will arise, and he will rule with great dominion, and he will do as he pleases. But as he rises in power, his kingdom will be divided toward the four winds of heaven, but not to his posterity, and not according to his dominion by which he ruled. For his kingdom will be uprooted and given to others besides them. I don't even have to tell you who this is. We've talked about him. He's been in almost every vision in the book of Daniel to this point. It's Alexander the Great. I won't read the whole thing again because it's just the king is Alexander the Great, who is going to raise up and fight and defeat the Persians, but then die without an heir, so his kingdom gets divided to the four winds. So verse 5, then the king of the south will grow strong, and also one of his officials, and he will grow stronger than him, and he will rule a dominion greater than his dominion. I think this verse is a nice one for showing what some of the trouble is and difficulty of reading through this passage are all the pronouns. Like, who is he to begin with? And then, yes, which he are we talking about? The king, one of the officials, whatever. So interpreting the pronouns is a key thing. But here I'm going to replace the pronouns with the proper names, which I'm also doing in these verses, unless it's crystal clear who the pronoun refers to. But here in verse 5, it's not. So this is what it reads with the proper names in place. Then Ptolemy the first, Soter, will grow strong, and also Seleucus, one of his officials. And Seleucus will grow stronger than Ptolemy, and Seleucus will rule a dominion greater than Ptolemy's dominion. So Ptolemy the first, Soter, is the first king of the Ptolemaic Empire, or kingdom, which ruled in Egypt. So that was his area. He was one of Alexander's generals who took control of the Egyptian part of Alexander's kingdom. Seleucus was one of his generals under Ptolemy. So Ptolemy was the top dog, and Seleucus was one of his subordinates in the army. But Seleucus ended up taking control of what we would call Syria and Palestine, or that area. Palestine was a debatable area between Syria and Egypt. So Syria and Egypt are what we're talking about. Ancient Syria, not the modern state. But ancient Syria and Egypt, Seleucus and the Seleucid kingdom was the northern area we call Syria now, or that area. And then Ptolemy was the Ptolemaic kingdom, which was Egypt. So we're talking about those two kings. And you can imagine why it would become important for Jerusalem and these two kings on either side of them. Verse 6. At the end of some years, they will make an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south will come to the king of the north to make a peace treaty. But she will not retain her position of power, and his offspring will not endure, and she will be given up, she and her attendants, and her child supporting her in those times. So here it is with the proper names in place. At the end of some 40 years, Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, will make an alliance with Antiochus II Theos. And Antiochus II is the Seleucid king. So the Syrian king of the north, one of the heirs after Seleucus. And Berenice, the daughter of Ptolemy II, will come to Antiochus II to make a peace treaty. But Berenice will not retain her position of power, and Antiochus' son by Berenice will not endure, and Berenice will be given up. Code for murdered. She and her attendants and her child supporting her in those times. So what's not clear here from this verse, but which becomes important on the next one, is that Berenice was Antiochus' second wife. He had a wife, Laodice, before her. Laodice did not like getting set aside by Berenice, and Laodice had Antiochus murdered, poisoned, I believe. She's behind his death. And after Antiochus died, she also killed Berenice and the son by her. All of this was so that her son, Laodice's son, could be the only heir to the Seleucid kingdom. And that's basically what happened. So let's read the next verse as it originally appears in the text, verses 7 and 8. And a branch from her roots will rise up in his place, and he will come against the army, and he will enter the stronghold of the king of the south, and he will take action against them, and he will prevail. And also their gods with their idols and with the precious vessels, silver and gold, he will take to Egypt into captivity, and for years he will leave the king of the north alone. So let's put in what that means. And Berenice's brother, that's a branch from her root. Her root would go back a generation, and then a branch would be her brother. So the Berenice's brother, Ptolemy III, Euergetes, will rise up in his place. And he will come against the army, and he will enter the capital city of Seleucus II. And Ptolemy III will take action against the army of Seleucus II, and Ptolemy III will prevail. And also their gods with their idols and with the precious vessels, silver and gold, he will take to Egypt into captivity, and for years he will leave the Seleucid kingdom alone. So he does just that. Verse 9. And then he will come into the kingdom of the king of the south, but he will return to his land. And again, the pronouns are crazy, but the only way we know who the he is that he's not the king of the south, so he must be the king of the north. And we know that this is true. The heir, Seleucus II Calonicus, who is Laodice's son. This is the heir that she was angling for and did in fact take control after Berenice and her son were killed, and Antiochus. Seleucus II will come into the kingdom of Ptolemy III, but he will return to his land. So he was trying to attack, but didn't do much. There wasn't much there. Ptolemy III rebuffed the incursion. Verse 10. But his sons will wage war, and they will gather a multitude of great forces, and he will advance with great force, and he will overflow like a flood, and he will pass through, and he will return, and they will wage war up to his fortress. Now, the sons are the two sons of Seleucus II, the sons of Laodice's son, Seleucus II. Now, the first son did not reign very long, and he was succeeded by his own brother. And that's why it says the sons will wage war, or the brothers will wage war. The first brother reigned briefly, died, and then the second brother, Antiochus III, took the reins, and he was more successful. In fact, Antiochus III is known to history as Antiochus the Great because he had the most success of all of the Seleucid kings in his military action, at least for a while. Antiochus III will gather a multitude of great forces, and he will advance into Palestine with great force, and he will overflow like a flood, and he will pass through, and he will return, and they will wage war up to Raphia on the border between Palestine and Egypt. So that's what they did. He got that far. Then in verse 11, the king of the south will become furious, and he will go and he will battle against the king of the north, and he will muster a great multitude, and the multitude will be given into his hand. So, verse 11. Then Ptolemy IV, Philopator, will become furious. That's the king of Egypt, the king of the south at this time. Ptolemy IV, Philopator, will become furious. He will go and he will battle against Antiochus III. And Antiochus III will muster a great multitude, and the multitude will be given into Ptolemy IV's hand. This is probably the signature defeat of Antiochus the Great in this thing. Well, there was one that had more long-term influence on Antiochus III, but this one was probably his greatest military defeat, because Ptolemy IV had a smaller force and defeated a much larger force of Antiochus III when this occurred. So Antiochus was totally frustrated by this. Verse 12. When the multitude is carried off, his heart will be exalted, and he will overthrow tens of thousands, but he will not prevail. So when the multitude is carried off, Ptolemy IV's heart will be exalted. I mean, he just had this great military victory over a larger force. He was expected to lose, but he won. So he is feeling good about it. His heart is exalted. He overthrew tens of thousands, but he will not press his advantage. This is an interesting historical question, because after defeating Antiochus so soundly, he refused to take any additional territory. He basically reclaimed what Antiochus had claimed during the incursion, but no more. He stopped at that border and satisfied himself with retaking Palestine, basically, and then making peace with the Seleucids. To me, it sounds like a totally diplomatic solution to try to get peace, is just take back what territory you just immediately lost and then make peace. But in that day and age, it would have been considered a weakness to have such a decisive victory and then not make hay with it and take more territory. So, verse 13. And the king of the north will again raise a multitude greater than the former, and at the end of some years he will surely come with a great army and with great supplies. Well, this is Antiochus III again. This is the same ruler who decides to try again to attack and gets a bigger force than the first time. Verse 14. And in these times many will rise up against the king of the south, and the violent ones of your people will lift themselves to fulfill the vision, but they will fall. Now, this is the one little detail that we don't have a historical record that would reflect exactly what's going on. But there is some suggestion from Josephus' own chronicle of this period, and maybe some other sources. I didn't dig in too much to see what it was, but there was some suggestion that maybe there were rebels in Egypt at the time. Ptolemy V was actually an infant when his father died, and so he was king as an infant and had a regent. His regent is named Agathocles. He apparently had some pretty strict measures in place, and he ruled with an iron fist, we might say, on behalf of Ptolemy V, because Ptolemy V was a baby. So that's what the situation is, and so it appears that there were rebels. And so we'll read verse 14 as, and in these times many rebels will rise up against Ptolemy V, Epiphanes, and the rebels among the Jews will lift themselves to fulfill the vision, but they will fail. Now this we actually have no independent verification that there was a specifically Jewish contingent of rebels who were trying to throw off Ptolemy V. This is basically the only historical comment that suggests it. And this idea of them fulfilling a vision. Nobody knows what particular vision they thought they were trying to fulfill by overthrowing Ptolemy V in this procedure. Most scholars just assume that there were some prophetic voices amongst the Jews, like there are at various times, who are false prophets, just trying to rouse the people up to the things they think they want and saying, yeah, go for it. And they did, but God was actually not behind that. And so they failed as well. I think the underlying theme throughout all of these visions is that God is in control of history, not humanity. And these people thought they were trying to do something for God, but God wasn't behind it, and so they failed. When God is behind it, it's going to succeed whether people are talking about it or not, like Gabriel holding up Darius. Whether that was something that people were talking about or not, it was God's design, and so he acted in his own design. Here, people were saying that they should rise up against Ptolemy V, but God wasn't behind it, and so it came to nothing. Verse 15. And Antiochus III will come, and he will throw up siege ramps and capture Sidon, and the military forces of Ptolemy V and his choice troops will not stand, for there is no strength left to resist. So I don't think I put the original wording up there, but it's just ambiguous. But there it is. Antiochus gets this big army together and invades Egypt and takes Sidon, or works to capture Sidon, and succeeds. But then, in verse 16, the one coming to him will act according to his pleasure, and there is no one to stand before him, and he will stand in the beautiful land, and complete destruction will be in his power. This is Antiochus III still doing what he wants, acting according to his pleasure. Ptolemy V doesn't stand against him, and he is in Palestine. The beautiful land is one of these key phrases. I think we've already seen it as a reference to Palestine, because it's beautiful, because that's where Jerusalem is, it's where the temple is, and so that is the beautiful land. And that is what Antiochus takes. And it is in this period of Antiochus III when Palestine switches hands from the Ptolemies to the Seleucids. And that's kind of the big shift that happens at this point. Verse 17. He will set his face to come with the authority of his whole kingdom, and will form an agreement, and he will act, and the daughter of women, he will give him to destroy it, but the ploy will not succeed, and she will not support him. So here is that with the proper names. Antiochus III will set his face to come with the authority of Ptolemy V's whole kingdom. In other words, Antiochus wants to take all of Egypt. Antiochus is he just took Palestine, and now his mind is to take all of Egypt and rule the whole thing. He will form an agreement, he will act, and he will give his daughter, Cleopatra, to Ptolemy V to undermine his position from within. So he makes this marriage peace agreement. I'll give you my daughter, and we'll have peace between our countries. But the plan is for Cleopatra to be on his side and to sway Ptolemy V and be kind of an inside mole, and then Antiochus will take advantage of that and then defeat Ptolemy V. However, it doesn't work out, and Cleopatra doesn't support Antiochus III at all, her father. She goes with her husband. Surprise, surprise. She stands up for Ptolemy V. So Cleopatra, the whole thing just falls apart. His inside job doesn't happen.
Is this the Cleopatra that we all know, or is this
No, this is the first Cleopatra of Egypt. That one that we know of, Antony and Cleopatra in the days of Rome and the days of Caesar Augustus. That's much later. But she's named after this one.
Right.
She takes Cleopatra's name from this Cleopatra. If you have the name Cleopatra, you have to be involved in some sort of Egyptian intrigue, political intrigue, apparently. Comes with the name. I want to suggest this one thing. This is the second time that the two kingdoms have tried to find some sort of peace through marriage. And to me, I just wonder if this has anything to do with what we read back in Daniel chapter 2 with the feet. Almost everyone just focuses on this mix of clay and iron and how they don't mix together. But in and amongst that is this note: they will mix in marriage and they will not cling to one another. There seems to be this thing that there's an attempt to get these things together through marriage, but it fails. I don't see a big reason for Daniel in chapter 11 to go into all of this history if he isn't showing a pattern here that is consistent. And so I'm just throwing it out there as a possibility that this failure to mix the feet of clay and iron isn't something to do with these abortive attempts to reconcile the Seleucid and the Ptolemaic kingdoms through this peace agreement of marriage. I don't know. It strikes me as possible.
But was this one really a peace agreement? Because it seemed like it says, and you will give him a daughter in marriage in order to overthrow the kingdom. So.
Well, it was ostensibly a peace agreement, but it was an ulterior motive to undermine the kingdom. And remember that in the previous visions, this little horn talks about gaining power through intrigue, through deception. This is one example. And this isn't even Antiochus IV, which is our Antiochus Epiphanes. This is his father, or actually grandfather, doing similar kinds of sneaky things to try to gain power. It's just sort of the thing. He will turn his face to the coastlands and he will capture many, but a commander will end his insults to him, so that instead his insults will turn back upon him. Well, this is where Antiochus III went too far. He does try to take the coastal areas of Egypt and succeeds for the most part in taking a lot of coastal territory, but he starts taking coastal territory of Roman interests as well as Ptolemaic interests. And actually the Ptolemies have been buddying up with the Romans, so while the Romans are gathering their strength up in Italy, in that area, they're gathering, and the Ptolemies and the Romans have been friendly. So when Antiochus starts attacking the Ptolemies and then starts threatening actual Roman interests along with them, they get up in arms. So it's the Roman general, Lucius Scipio, who ends his insults and defeats him soundly. We notice the phrase in the original, a commander. It may be that it's the reason it's a commander and not the king of the north or the king of the south or a person of the king of the south is because this is Rome, who is now getting interested, much to Antiochus' dismay. And the Roman general ends it and defeats him so soundly at Magnesia. This is the place where he was defeated. I have to wonder if milk of Magnesia is named after this place. I don't know. But in Magnesia, Scipio defeats Antiochus III soundly and in fact demands a huge payment to the Romans for their trouble. It's like having to pay the court costs when you lose the battle, lose the legal battle. Well, here they have to pay Rome for all of the losses, and it's like this tribute they have to pay. And so, in verse 19, he will turn back his face towards the strongholds of his land, and he will stumble, and he will fall, and will not be found. Well, this is Antiochus. Antiochus goes back to his own homeland, where he starts raiding his own people for the money to pay Rome. And one of the places that he attacks is a temple of Bel, the god Bel, as in Daniel and Bel and the dragon. This god Bel is one of these temples where Antiochus attacks. His own people rebel against him because of that, and he's killed in the process. So that's why he falls and is not found. And then this is the final verse. In his place will arise one sending an official throughout the glory of his kingdom, and in a few days he will be broken, but not in anger and not in battle. So this is his successor, his son Seleucus IV, Philopator, who is sending his finance minister, Heliodorus, throughout the glory of his kingdom to try to raise money to pay off the Romans. So this thing, it kills Antiochus III because he's trying to raise the money by just raiding the temple. And now his son is trying to raise the money by sending his finance minister out, basically raising taxes and trying to gather all the money from people Then after 12 years, he's broken, not in anger and not in battle. This whole verse talking about how it's just a few days when it's 12 years, which for some rulers back then isn't something to sneeze at, but it's so short compared to his father's reign, which was a long and prosperous reign for the most part until he met the Romans. But here, he's not there for as long, and he is murdered by his own people in a conspiracy. So that's why it's not in battle. It's not some glorious end by trying to take territory, and it's not in anger. It's just a conspiracy of, apparently Heliodorus is behind it, killing his own king. I guess he just got tired of raising people's taxes, but he kills him. And there is a suggestion that maybe Heliodorus had an ally, a person we will know as Antiochus IV, who is interested in taking the kingdom. And so Antiochus and Heliodorus apparently conspired to kill Seleucus IV in this process. So, what's the point of all of this historical intrigue? I think there are two main reasons for this long description of an ambiguous description in chapter 11. One, I think it explains why the Empire of Greece becomes a critical part of Jewish history. Because as soon as Greece takes into control, and then when Alexander dies and divides up the territory, Palestine gets right in the middle between two antagonistic generals, and for a century, more than a century, it's back and forth, and Jerusalem's caught in the middle. And it's really this dynamic that creates that tension. And secondly, I think it's the idea that this tension is actually divinely appointed. It was predicted. It was part of God's book of truth. So as terrible as it was to live between these two warring factions, it was actually God unfolding his will that this was all happening. So I think those are the two takeaways of these verses. Now, after the death of this Seleucus IV, we get to the man of the hour, the Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who is the one that is really the focus.
Thank you for taking time to study the book of Daniel with me. I hope you'll take a moment and add a comment under the YouTube video, or hop over to Facebook and find the Storeroom of Scripture discussion group and join our discussion there. And you can always email me directly at storeroomofscripture@comcast.net. I hope you'll find this lesson to be a blessing to you, and that you'll join us again as we uncover the treasures in the biblical text.